At 06:14 hours on the morning of June 12, 1943, Second Lieutenant Frank Caldwell sat in the cockpit of his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk on Amchitka Island, staring at the extra machine gun bolted under his left wing, the same gun his squadron mates had been mocking for 3 solid weeks. 24 years old, former crop duster from Nebraska, 0 confirmed kills. The Japanese had been running bombing raids from Kiska Island every 72 hours, and in the past 2 weeks, they had sunk 1 destroyer and damaged 3 cargo ships trying to resupply American forces in the Aleutians. Caldwell's squadron commander had called the extra gun a waste of weight. The other pilots called it his mail-order girlfriend. When he had bolted the Harney and Giles 30 caliber machine gun to a custom mount, he had fabricated himself using scrap aluminum from a wrecked bomber at Cold Bay. The crew chief wanted to know if Caldwell planned to hunt moose or fight Zeros. Caldwell explained it was for Japanese fighters. The crew chief laughed and walked away. The gun had arrived 3 months earlier in a wooden crate, shipped from a sporting goods warehouse in Seattle. Caldwell had ordered it with his own money after reading about experimental gun configurations in an aviation magazine. The Harney and Giles was a lightweight air-cooled machine gun originally designed for training aircraft. It weighed 14 pounds. The standard 50 caliber Brownings mounted in the P-40's nose weighed 64 pounds each. The Harney and Giles fired 30 caliber ammunition at 850 rounds per minute. The Brownings fired 50 caliber at 850 rounds per minute, but with significantly more recoil. Caldwell's theory was simple. Mount a lightweight gun under the wing to create asymmetric drag during tight turns. The extra drag would tighten his turn radius without requiring full rudder input. In combat against the highly maneuverable Japanese Zero, turn radius was everything. The Zero could outturn any American fighter in level flight. But if Caldwell could create controlled asymmetric drag, he might be able to match the Zero's turn rate for a few critical seconds. Long enough to shake a Zero off his tail or reposition for a defensive escape. The problem was that nobody believed him. Major Harrison, the squadron commander, told Caldwell that aerodynamics did not work that way. You did not improve performance by adding drag. You removed drag. Adding weight and drag to one wing would destabilize the aircraft and make it harder to control, not easier. The other pilots agreed. They said Caldwell was wasting time and money on a gadget that would get him killed. Caldwell installed the gun anyway. He spent 2 weeks testing the configuration over the Bering Sea. He flew mock dogfights against other P-40s. He practiced tight turns at various speeds and altitudes. He learned how to use the throttle and the asymmetric drag from the wing-mounted gun to create turns that his P-40 should not have been capable of executing. The maneuver was not pretty. The aircraft shuddered, the controls felt mushy, but the turn radius tightened by approximately 8% compared to a standard P-40 configuration. 8% did not sound like much, but in a dogfight against a Zero, 8% could mean the difference between getting shot down and getting home. By early June, Caldwell had flown the modified P-40 on 12 combat air patrols over the Aleutians. 0 contact with enemy aircraft. The Japanese bombers came in at night or during heavy fog. The few times American fighters scrambled to intercept, the Japanese were already gone by the time the P-40s reached altitude. On June 11th, intelligence reported increased Japanese radio traffic from Kiska Island. Something was coming. A major raid, probably targeting the American base at Amchitka. Amchitka was critical. It was the forward operating base for American air operations in the Aleutians. If the Japanese could knock out the runway or destroy the fuel depot, American forces would lose their ability to intercept Japanese shipping and bombing raids for weeks. Major Harrison briefed the squadron that evening. Expect multiple waves of Japanese bombers escorted by Zeros. The bombers would be Mitsubishi G4M Bettys, twin-engine medium bombers with a crew of 7 and a bomb load of 1,264 pounds. Fast, maneuverable, but lightly armored. A few good hits from 50 caliber guns would bring one down. The Zeros were a different problem. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was the best carrier-based fighter in the world in 1943. Maximum speed of 350 miles per hour. Service ceiling of 33,000 feet. Turn time of 16 seconds at 240 miles per hour. The P-40 Warhawk could not match those numbers. Maximum speed of 360 miles per hour, but only in level flight. Service ceiling of 29,000 feet. Turn time of 22 seconds at 240 miles per hour. In a turning fight, the Zero would win every time. American pilots had learned not to dogfight Zeros. The tactic was boom and zoom. Dive from altitude, make one high-speed pass, keep diving, do not turn, do not climb, do not try to outmaneuver the Zero. Hit and run. But that tactic only worked if you had altitude advantage and clear visibility. In the Aleutians, weather was unpredictable. Fog rolled in without warning. Cloud cover could drop from 10,000 feet to 500 feet in minutes. If you got caught in a turning fight at low altitude with a Zero on your tail, the boom and zoom tactic would not save you. You had to turn, you had to outmaneuver, or you had to do something the Zero pilot did not expect. Caldwell sat in his cockpit at 0614 hours on June 12th and ran through his pre-flight checklist. Oil pressure, fuel mixture, magnetos, gun charging handles. The 450 caliber Brownings in the nose were loaded with 235 rounds each. The wing-mounted Harney and Giles had 200 rounds of 30 caliber, ball ammunition. Caldwell had loaded the belt himself. Every fifth round was a tracer. He reached down and flipped the arming switch for the wing gun. A red light on the panel confirmed the gun was live. Major Harrison's voice crackled over the radio. Radar had picked up multiple contacts inbound from the northwest, range 47 miles, altitude 8,000 feet, speed 190 miles per hour. Estimated time to target, 15 minutes. The squadron scrambled. 12 P-40 Warhawks rolled down the Amchitka runway and climbed into the gray Aleutian sky. Caldwell was number 7 in the formation. He climbed to 12,000 feet and leveled off. The formation spread out into a combat spread. 2 ship elements with 500 yards separation. Visibility was poor. Cloud cover at 10,000 feet. Heavy mist below 5,000 feet. The kind of weather where you could lose sight of your wingman in seconds. At 0628 hours, the radar controller called out the contact. Bandits at 11 o'clock, range 12 miles, altitude 8,000 feet. Caldwell scanned the horizon through his canopy. Nothing but gray clouds and gray ocean. Then he saw them, black dots rising out of the cloud layer. 9 aircraft in a loose V formation. The Bettys, and above them, smaller dots weaving back and forth. The Zeros, 4 of them. Major Harrison called the attack. Engage the bombers. Ignore the fighters. Hit the Bettys and get out. The P-40s dove. 12 American fighters dropping from 12,000 feet to 8,000 feet in a steep, high-speed dive. Caldwell pushed the throttle forward. The P-40's Allison engine roared. Airspeed climbed past 400 miles per hour. The bombers grew larger in his windscreen. He could see the greenhouse canopies, the twin engines, the bomb bay doors. At 1,200 yards, Caldwell opened fire. The 450 caliber Brownings hammered. Tracers arced toward the lead Betty. The Japanese bomber jinked right. Caldwell corrected, walked his fire across the bomber's left wing. Pieces of metal flew off. Smoke poured from the left engine. But Caldwell did not see the bomber go down. He was already pulling up, executing the boom and zoom. Climb back to altitude, reset, make another pass. except the Zeros were waiting. Caldwell saw the first Zero diving toward him from 2 o'clock high. He banked left and pushed the throttle to full power. The Zero followed. Caldwell's airspeed was 380 miles per hour. The Zero was faster in the dive. It closed the distance to 800 yards, 600 yards, 400 yards. Caldwell could see the red circles on the Zero's wings. He could see the muzzle flashes from the Zero's twin 20-millimeter cannons. Tracers streaked past his canopy. One round punched through his left wing 6 feet from the fuselage. Caldwell broke right, hard right, full stick, full rudder. The P-40 rolled into a tight descending turn. The Zero followed. Caldwell tried to tighten the turn, but the P-40 was already at its limits. The stall warning horn blared. The controls shook. The Zero was still behind him, still closing. Caldwell made his decision. He throttled back slightly and activated the wing-mounted Harney and Giles gun. The lightweight .30 caliber started firing, not at the Zero, but into empty air. The recoil was minimal, but the gun's position under the left wing created asymmetric drag. The P-40's turn radius tightened, not by much, maybe 10 feet, but 10 feet was enough. The Zero overshot. The Japanese pilot had anticipated Caldwell's turn radius based on standard P-40 performance. When Caldwell's turn tightened unexpectedly, the Zero could not adjust fast enough. It flashed past Caldwell's right wing at a distance of less than 50 feet. Caldwell saw the Japanese pilot's face through the Zero's canopy. Young, focused, already pulling back on the stick to loop around for another attack. But Caldwell did not wait for the loop. He rolled left, dove toward the cloud layer, and disappeared into the mist at 5,000 feet. The Zero did not follow. Japanese pilots had been trained to avoid prolonged engagements in poor visibility. The risk of spatial disorientation was too high. Caldwell leveled off inside the cloud layer and checked his instruments. Altitude 4,800 feet, airspeed 280 miles per hour, fuel at 70%. All 4 Brownings still operational. The Harney and Giles was empty. Caldwell had burned through all 200 rounds in that one turn, but the gun had worked. The asymmetric drag had tightened his turn just enough to force the Zero into an overshoot. Caldwell climbed back up through the clouds and rejoined the formation. The Bettys were retreating northwest. 2 of them were trailing smoke. One was losing altitude rapidly. The Zeros were still circling, but they were not pursuing the American fighters. They were covering the bombers' withdrawal. Major Harrison ordered the squadron to return to base. Do not chase. Do not engage. Mission accomplished. The P-40s landed at Amchitka at 0701 hours. Caldwell taxied to his revetment and shut down the engine. The crew chief climbed onto the wing and stared at the bullet hole in the left wing. 6 inches from the fuselage. Clean entry, no exit. The round had lodged in the wing spar without damaging any control surfaces. Pure luck. 6 inches closer, and it would have severed the aileron cables. Then he looked at the empty Harney and Giles gun. The barrel was still warm, carbon scoring around the ejection port. All 200 rounds expended. He wanted to know what happened. Caldwell explained the engagement in detail. 1-0 diving from 2 o'clock high. Closing speed approximately 120 miles per hour. Standard evasive maneuvers not working. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, gaining position. Caldwell had maybe 10 seconds before the Zero would be in optimal firing position. He made the call, activated the wing gun to create asymmetric drag. Not firing at the Zero, just firing forward into empty air. The recoil and drag from the lightweight .30 caliber gun mounted under the left wing created an imbalance. The imbalance tightened the turn radius. Not by much, maybe 8 to 10 feet, but enough. Enough that when Caldwell rolled left into a descending turn, the P-40 turned sharper than the Zero pilot anticipated. The Japanese pilot had calculated his intercept based on standard P-40 performance characteristics. When Caldwell's aircraft turned tighter than expected, the Zero overshot. Flashed past Caldwell's right wing at less than 50 feet, close enough that Caldwell could see the pilot's face, the leather helmet, the oxygen mask. The Zero pulled up to loop around for another attack, but Caldwell did not wait. He dove into the cloud layer at 5,000 feet and disappeared. The Zero did not follow. Japanese doctrine discouraged prolonged engagements in poor visibility, too much risk of spatial disorientation, too easy to lose situational awareness and fly into the ocean. The crew chief listened to the entire explanation without interrupting. When Caldwell finished, the crew chief shook his head slowly. He said asymmetric drag would destabilize the aircraft, not improve maneuverability. Every aerodynamics manual said so. Every flight instructor taught it. Adding drag to one wing made the aircraft harder to control, not easier. It created adverse yaw, increased stall risk, reduced overall performance. Caldwell pointed at the bullet hole in the wing. 6 inches from the fuselage. He said he was still alive. He said the Zero pilot was probably back on Kiska, wondering what the hell just happened. He said manuals and instructors were useful, but they did not account for desperate situations against superior aircraft. Sometimes you had to try things that should not work because the alternative was getting shot down. The crew chief had no response to that. He climbed down from the wing and walked away without another word. But 2 hours later, he came back with Sergeant Briggs, the squadron armorer. They wanted to know if Caldwell could replicate the maneuver. If it worked once, could it work again? Or was it just luck? Caldwell said it was not luck, it was physics. Asymmetric drag created asymmetric lift and yaw. If you controlled the throttle and rudder inputs correctly, you could use that asymmetry to tighten turns beyond normal performance limits. The key was modulation. Too much drag and you would stall, too little and you would not see any benefit. You had to practice. You had to develop a feel for how the aircraft responded. Sergeant Briggs asked if Caldwell wanted more ammunition for the wing gun. 200 rounds had been barely enough for one engagement. If Caldwell planned to use the tactic regularly, he would need more. Caldwell agreed. They would need to fabricate a larger ammunition box. If you are sitting there wondering how a mail-order machine gun mounted under a fighter's wing could outmaneuver the most advanced carrier fighter in the world, hit that like button. It lets us know you want more of these forgotten engineering stories from World War II, and if you have not subscribed yet, do it now. We are bringing you stories your granddad never got to tell, stories that got buried in dusty after-action reports and forgotten maintenance logs. These are not Hollywood tales. These are real men solving real problems with grit and ingenuity. Now, back to Caldwell and that jury-rigged gun. The squadron debriefing took place at 1400 hours in the operations tent. Major Harrison wanted details on the bomber attack. How many hits, how many kills, ammunition expenditure, aircraft damage. The pilots reported 2 Bettys confirmed destroyed, 1 probable, 6 damaged. 3 P-40s had taken minor damage from defensive fire. No American aircraft lost, but Major Harrison was more interested in Caldwell's engagement with the Zero. Caldwell described the encounter in detail. The Zero diving from 2 o'clock high, the initial evasive turn, the Zero closing despite full throttle, the decision to activate the wing gun to create asymmetric drag, the tightened turn radius, the Zero overshooting. Harrison asked if the wing gun had been firing at the Zero or just firing into empty air. Caldwell confirmed he had been firing into empty air. The gun was not aimed at the Zero. It was aimed forward and down, creating drag and recoil on the left wing. The asymmetric forces tightened the left turn. Harrison wanted to know if Caldwell could replicate the maneuver. Caldwell said he could, but he would need more ammunition for the wing gun. 200 rounds was not enough for extended engagements. Harrison told Caldwell to work with the armorer to fabricate a larger ammunition box for the Harney and Giles. If the tactic worked once, it could work again. The other pilots were skeptical. They gathered around Caldwell after the debriefing, asking questions, poking holes in his explanation. Lieutenant Kowalski was the most vocal. He was a farm kid from Wisconsin, 22 years old, aggressive pilot, by-the-book tactician. He said the Zero overshoot was luck, pure and simple, not aerodynamics. The Japanese pilot had misjudged the turn. Maybe he was inexperienced. Maybe he was low on fuel and did not want to commit to a prolonged engagement. Maybe he had another target in mind and broke off for tactical reasons. It had nothing to do with asymmetric drag from a mail-order machine gun. Lieutenant Hayes backed him up. Hayes was older, 29, former airline pilot with Pan American. He had flown DC-3s across the Pacific before the war. He understood aerodynamics better than most of the younger pilots. He said adding drag to one wing would make the aircraft harder to control, not easier. You would have to fight the controls constantly to maintain coordinated flight. The tactic was dangerous and unpredictable. One wrong input, and you would snap into a spin. At low altitude over water, a spin was a death sentence. You would not have enough altitude to recover before you hit the ocean. Hayes said Caldwell had gotten lucky. The Zero pilot made a mistake. That was the only reason Caldwell made it back. If Caldwell tried the same maneuver again, he would probably kill himself before the Zero got a chance. Caldwell listened to all of it without arguing. He understood their skepticism. Hell, he had been skeptical himself when he first tested the wing gun configuration. The idea sounded insane on paper. Adding weight and drag to improve performance? It violated every principle of aircraft design. But the testing over the Bering Sea had proven the concept. The turn radius tightened. Not by much, but enough. And combat was not about perfect solutions. It was about finding any advantage, no matter how small, and exploiting it. Caldwell said they could believe what they wanted. He was not trying to convert anyone. He was not writing a training manual. He just knew what had worked for him. He had a bullet hole in his wing and an empty gun. The Zero pilot had a long flight back to Kiska, wondering what the hell just happened. That was all the proof Caldwell needed. But Kowalski would not let it go. He kept pushing. He said if the tactic really worked, Caldwell should demonstrate it. Take a P-40 up with another pilot flying chase. Execute the maneuver. Show everyone how asymmetric drag could outturn a standard configuration aircraft. Put up or shut up. Caldwell said he would think about it. He did not owe anyone a demonstration. But part of him wanted to prove the skeptics wrong. Not for ego, just for the principle. These guys were good pilots, but they were locked into conventional thinking. They could not imagine that an unconventional solution might work in unconventional circumstances. That kind of rigid thinking got people killed in combat. That night, Caldwell and the squadron armorer, Sergeant Briggs, worked on fabricating a larger ammunition box for the Harney and Giles. They worked by lamplight in the maintenance tent while the rest of the squadron slept. The original box held 200 rounds in a compact rectangular container that mounted directly beneath the wing gun. Simple design, lightweight, but too small for extended combat. Briggs was a machinist from Pittsburgh. He had worked in a steel mill before the war, fabricating parts for industrial equipment. He knew how to work with metal, how to weld, how to shape aluminum and steel into functional components. He looked at the original ammunition box and said he could build something better. They walked to the salvage area behind the maintenance sheds. This was where wrecked aircraft ended up after being stripped for usable parts. P-40s that had ground-looped on landing, a B-24 that had crash-landed with engine failure, the remains of a Japanese float plane that had been shot down 3 months earlier and recovered from the ocean. Briggs studied the Japanese float plane. The fuselage was corroded from salt water, but some of the aluminum panels were still intact. Thinner than American aircraft aluminum, but strong enough for an ammunition box. Briggs cut away a section of fuselage skin using a hacksaw. He measured it, marked it, bent it into shape over a metal brake. He welded the seams using an oxyacetylene torch. The work took 4 hours. By 0200 hours, they had a new ammunition box, rectangular, 18 inches long, 8 inches wide, 6 inches deep, capacity for 400 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition. The box weighed 6 pounds empty, 18 pounds loaded, an additional 12 pounds compared to the original 200-round box. Caldwell said the extra weight was worth it. More ammunition meant more time to use the asymmetric drag tactic, more flexibility in combat. Briggs fabricated a mounting bracket to attach the new box to the wing pylon beneath the Harney Giles gun. The bracket bolted directly to the existing hardpoint, no modifications to the wing structure required. By 0400 hours, the new ammunition box was installed on Caldwell's P-40. Briggs loaded it with 400 rounds of .30 caliber ball ammunition and connected the feed belt to the gun. He test-fired the gun to ensure the feed system worked. 10-round burst. No jams, no misfires. The gun cycled smoothly. Caldwell thanked Briggs and headed to his tent to sleep. He had 2 hours before revel, 2 hours to rest before another day of patrols and the possibility of another engagement with Japanese fighters. Caldwell took the modified P-40 up for a test flight the next morning at 0700 hours. The weather was overcast, low clouds at 6,000 feet, visibility 3 miles. Typical Aleutian conditions, cold, gray, unpredictable. Caldwell climbed to 10,000 feet above the cloud layer and leveled off. He practiced tight turns with the wing gun firing. The maneuver felt different with the larger ammunition box. The extra weight changed the aircraft's balance slightly. The nose wanted to drop in the turn. Caldwell compensated with slight back pressure on the stick and a touch of throttle. After a few practice runs, he developed a rhythm. Activate the wing gun, roll into the turn, modulate throttle and rudder to control the asymmetric drag, tighten the turn without stalling, recover smoothly without overshooting the desired heading. The maneuver was smoother with practice. Caldwell learned to anticipate the P-40's response to the asymmetric forces. He learned where the limits were, how tight he could turn before the stall warning horn started blaring, how much rudder input he needed to keep the nose from dropping too far. He ran through the maneuver 20 times during the test flight. Each time, the turn radius tightened by approximately 10% compared to a standard P-40 turn. 10% still did not sound like much when you said it out loud. But when you visualized it in three-dimensional space during a high-speed turning engagement, 10% was enormous. 10% could mean the difference between a 0 staying on your tail or overshooting and losing position. Caldwell had seen what 10% could do against a 0 pilot who did not expect it. He landed at 0843 hours and taxied back to his revetment. The crew chief was waiting. He asked how the test flight went. Caldwell said it went well. The larger ammunition box worked. The gun fed reliably. The maneuver was repeatable. He could use it in combat again if necessary. The crew chief wanted to know if Caldwell planned to demonstrate the maneuver for the other pilots. Caldwell said maybe, if the opportunity came up. But he was not going to schedule a demonstration just to satisfy Kowalski's skepticism. If the other pilots wanted to learn the technique, they could ask. If they wanted to keep mocking the mail-order gun, that was their choice. The crew chief nodded and walked away. He was starting to believe that maybe Caldwell was onto something. Maybe the mail-order gun was not such a joke after all. The Japanese returned on June 15, 1943, 3 days after Caldwell's first engagement with the Zero. Radar picked up contacts at 0537 hours, range 52 miles, bearing 310 degrees, altitude 9,000 feet, speed 200 miles per hour. 12 aircraft in formation. The radar operator estimated arrival at Amchitka in approximately 16 minutes, probably another Betty bomber raid with Zero escorts. Same playbook as before. The bombers would target the fuel depot or the runway. The Zeros would provide top cover and engage any American fighters that tried to intercept. Major Harrison scrambled the squadron. 12 P-40 Warhawks rolled down the runway and climbed into the morning sky. Caldwell was number 5 in the formation this time. He climbed to 13,000 feet and waited, scanning the horizon for the first glimpse of the incoming Japanese formation. The wait was always the worst part. You knew they were coming. You knew approximately where they would appear, but you could not see them yet. Your mind started running through scenarios. How many Zeros? What altitude would they be at? Would they engage immediately or wait for the P-40s to commit to attacking the bombers? Would the weather hold, or would clouds roll in and complicate the engagement? Caldwell checked his fuel. 90%. He checked his guns. 450 caliber Brownings in the nose, each loaded with 235 rounds. The wing-mounted Harney and Giles loaded with 400 rounds of 30 caliber. He flipped the arming switch for all guns. Red lights on the panel confirmed they were live. The Japanese formation appeared at 0551 hours, right on schedule, 10 Bettys in 2V formations of 5 aircraft each, and above them, weaving back and forth in a defensive pattern, 6 Zeros. 6, not 4. More fighters than the last raid. The Japanese were adapting, bringing more escorts to protect the bombers. Major Harrison called the attack over the radio. Same tactic as before. Engage the bombers, ignore the fighters unless directly engaged. Get in, hit the Bettys hard, get out. Do not stick around for prolonged dogfights with the Zeros. The P-40s dove from 13,000 feet to 9,000 feet in a steep high-speed attack run. Caldwell targeted a Betty on the right side of the lead formation. Big aircraft, twin engines, greenhouse canopy, glinting in the pale Aleutian sunlight. He put the gun sight pipper on the bomber's right engine nacelle and waited until the range closed to 1,400 yards. Then he opened fire. The 450 caliber Brownings hammered. The sound was deafening even through the engine noise and the slipstream. Tracers arced toward the Betty in a bright stream. Caldwell walked the fire across the bomber's right wing and into the engine. Pieces of metal flew off. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The Betty's right engine was on fire. The bomber dropped out of formation and began losing altitude, trailing smoke and flames. Caldwell pulled up from the attack run and immediately scanned for threats. This was the critical moment. You had just committed to an attack. You were pulling up, bleeding off speed, vulnerable. If a Zero was positioned correctly, this was when he would dive on you. Caldwell saw them, 2 Zeros diving toward the P-40 formation from 11 o'clock high. They were targeting the American fighters as they pulled up from the bomber attack. Classic tactic. Wait for the enemy to commit, then hit them when they are slow and vulnerable. Caldwell banked right and pushed the throttle to full power. The Allison engine roared. Airspeed started climbing, but the Zeros were faster in the dive. They were closing. Caldwell glanced left and right, looking for his wingman. gone. The formation had scattered during the attack. Every pilot was on his own now. Caldwell was alone at 9,500 feet with two Zeros diving on him. He had maybe 15 seconds before they were in firing range. He could try to dive away, use the P-40's superior dive speed to outrun them. But they had altitude advantage. They would catch him in the dive before he could build enough speed. He could try to turn and engage head-on, force them to break off or commit to a head-on gun pass where his .450 calibers gave him an advantage over their lighter armament. But there were two of them. If he committed to one, the other would have a free shot at him. Or he could use the wing gun tactic, create unpredictable flight characteristics, and force them to react to something they did not expect. Caldwell made his choice. He banked right and climbed slightly, as if he was trying to gain altitude. The Zeros adjusted their dive angle to intercept. They were working as a team. One was diving steep to cut off Caldwell's climb. The other was diving shallow to cover the low escape route. Classic pincer attack. Caldwell waited until the lead Zero was 800 yards out and closing. Then he activated the wing-mounted Harney and Giles gun and rolled hard left into a tight descending spiral. The .30 caliber gun hammered, spitting tracers forward and down into empty air. The recoil and drag created asymmetric forces on the left wing. The P-40's turn tightened dramatically. Caldwell corkscrewed down through 9,000 feet, 8,500 feet, 8,000 feet. The spiral was tighter than any standard P-40 maneuver. The G-forces pressed Caldwell into his seat. His vision started to gray at the edges. He eased back slightly on the stick to keep from blacking out. The lead Zero tried to follow the spiral. The Japanese pilot rolled left and pulled hard, trying to match Caldwell's turn rate. But the Zero could not tighten its turn enough without stalling. The airframe shuddered as it approached its limits. The Zero pilot had two choices: ease off and lose the angle, or keep pulling and risk a high-speed stall. He chose to ease off. The Zero's nose came up slightly, bleeding off turn rate. That was all Caldwell needed. He came out of the spiral at 7,200 feet with the lead 1,200 yards behind him and above him. No shot. The second Zero was diving to intercept, but Caldwell had altitude and energy now. He pulled up into a climbing turn, forcing the second Zero to adjust its dive angle. The second Zero pilot tried to lead the turn, anticipating where Caldwell would be. But Caldwell activated the wing gun again and tightened the turn beyond what the Zero pilot expected. The second Zero overshot, flashing past Caldwell's canopy at a distance of maybe 200 feet. Close. Too close. Caldwell could see rivets on the Zero's fuselage. He could see the meatball insignia on the wing. He could see the pilot turning his head to track Caldwell's position. Then the Zero was gone, climbing away to reposition. Both Zeros had lost their angle. Caldwell had maybe 10 seconds before they came around for another attack. He used those 10 seconds to dive toward a cloud layer at 6,000 feet. He disappeared into the clouds before the Zeros could reposition. Japanese doctrine discouraged prolonged engagements in clouds. Too much risk, too easy to become disoriented. Caldwell flew straight and level inside the cloud layer for 30 seconds, then turned 90 degrees and climbed back up to 8,000 feet. When he emerged from the clouds, the Zeros were gone. They had broken off to rejoin the bomber formation, which was already retreating northwest toward Kiska. The second engagement confirmed what Caldwell had suspected. The wing gun tactic worked not because it improved the P-40's performance, but because it created unpredictable flight characteristics. The Zeros were accustomed to fighting P-40s that flew in predictable ways. Straight dives, wide turns, boom and zoom tactics. When Caldwell used asymmetric drag to tighten his turns or create unusual flight paths, the Zero pilots could not adapt fast enough. They overshot. They misjudged closing speeds. They lost angles. Caldwell was not outflying the Zeros, he was confusing them. By late June, Caldwell had flown 8 combat missions with the modified P-40. He had engaged Zeros on 5 of those missions, 0 losses, 0 hits, 3 confirmed overshoots where the Zero pilot lost position and broke off the engagement. The other pilots in the squadron stopped mocking the wing gun. Lieutenant Kowalski asked Caldwell if he could install a similar setup on his own P-40. Caldwell said he could, but it would require custom fabrication and a lot of practice. The tactic was not intuitive. You had to learn how to use throttle, rudder, and gun recoil together to control the asymmetric drag. Kowalski decided against it. Too complicated, too much risk. But 2 other pilots, Lieutenant Hayes and Lieutenant Drummond, decided to try it. Caldwell worked with Sergeant Briggs to fabricate wing-mounted gun setups for their P-40s. Hayes installed a Harney and Giles under his left wing, same as Caldwell. Drummond installed a lighter Browning .30 caliber under his right wing. Different weight, different recoil characteristics, but the same basic principle. Both pilots spent a week practicing the maneuver over the Bering Sea. Hayes adapted quickly. He had flown crop dusters before the war and was comfortable with unconventional flight characteristics. Drummond struggled. He said the asymmetric drag made the aircraft feel unstable. He could execute the tight turns, but he could not control the recovery. He kept overshooting his intended flight path. After 3 near stalls during practice flights, Drummond removed the wing gun and went back to a standard P-40 configuration. Hayes kept his wing gun and flew his first combat mission with it on July 3rd. The Japanese launched another bombing raid that morning, 8 Bettys, 4 Zeros. Hayes engaged a Zero during the bomber attack. He used the wing gun tactic to tighten a right turn and force the Zero into an overshoot. The Zero pilot broke off and retreated. Hayes returned to base with no damage. The tactic had worked for him the same way it had worked for Caldwell. By mid-July, the Japanese had reduced the frequency of their bombing raids on Amchitka. Intelligence suggested they were conserving fuel and aircraft for operations in the Central Pacific. The Aleutian campaign was winding down. American forces had retaken Attu Island in May after a brutal 3-week battle. Kiska Island was next. The Japanese garrison on Kiska was isolated, cut off from resupply, and under constant air and naval bombardment. They would either evacuate or surrender. The final major air engagement over the Aleutians took place on July 22, 1943. Radar detected a large Japanese formation inbound from Kiska. Range 68 miles, altitude 11,000 feet, speed 210 miles per hour, 18 aircraft. The largest raid since early June. The squadron scrambled every available P-40. 16 fighters climbed to intercept. Caldwell was leading a 4-ship flight. Hayes was his wingman. The Japanese formation consisted of 12 Bettys and 6 Zeros. The bombers were targeting the fuel depot at Amchitka. If they hit the depot, the entire base would be without aviation fuel for weeks. Major Harrison ordered the squadron to focus on the bombers. Ignore the Zeros unless directly engaged. Stop the Bettys before they reached the target. The P-40s attacked from altitude. Caldwell's flight dove on the lead Betty formation. He fired a long burst from 1,600 yards. Tracers streaked into the lead bomber's cockpit. The Betty nosed over and began a steep dive toward the ocean. Caldwell pulled up and searched for his next target. A Zero was diving toward him from 3 o'clock high. Caldwell broke left and activated his wing gun. The familiar asymmetric drag tightened his turn. The Zero followed. but Caldwell rolled into a descending spiral. The Zero tried to follow, but could not match the turn rate. It overshot and climbed back to altitude. Caldwell leveled off and looked for Hayes. He found his wingman engaged with 2 Zeros at 9,000 feet. Hayes was using his wing gun to execute tight turns, but the 2 Zeros were coordinating their attacks. One would force Hayes into a turn, the other would position for a shot. Hayes was running out of altitude and options. Caldwell dove to assist. He came in from above and behind the trailing Zero. He fired a 2-second burst from the Brownings. The Zero's left wing exploded. The fighter rolled inverted and fell toward the ocean. The second Zero broke off and retreated. Hayes rejoined Caldwell's wing. Both pilots climbed back to altitude and scanned for more threats. The Betty formation was in disarray. 4 bombers were down. 3 more were trailing smoke and losing altitude. The remaining Bettys had jettisoned their bombs early and were retreating northwest. The Zeros were covering the withdrawal, but they were not engaging the American fighters anymore. The mission was over. The P-40s returned to Amchitka. Caldwell landed at 8:47 hours. He taxied to his revetment and shut down the engine. Sergeant Briggs climbed onto the wing and inspected the aircraft. No damage, all guns operational. The wing-mounted Harney and Giles had 87 rounds remaining. Caldwell had burned through 313 rounds during the engagement, most of it during the tight turns to evade the Zeros. Briggs asked if the gun had performed as expected. Caldwell said it had. 3 Zeros engaged, 3 Zeros evaded. 1 Zero shot down, but that was with the nose-mounted Brownings, not the wing gun. The wing gun was not a weapon. It was a tool to create unpredictable flight characteristics, a tool to survive. That afternoon, Major Harrison called Caldwell to his tent. Harrison had received a message from 5th Air Force headquarters in Alaska. They wanted a detailed report on the wing-mounted gun configuration and its tactical applications. Apparently, word had spread about Caldwell's unconventional setup. Other squadrons were asking questions. Was the tactic viable? Could it be standardized? Should other P-40 units adopt it? Caldwell spent 2 days writing the report. He described the gun setup, the fabrication process, the aerodynamic principles, the tactical applications. He included diagrams and performance data. He explained that the tactic was not about improving the P-40's performance. It was about creating flight characteristics the enemy did not expect. The report went up the chain of command. 5th Air Force forwarded it to the Air Technical Service Command for evaluation. Engineers at Wright Field in Ohio studied the data and concluded that the tactic was theoretically sound but impractical for widespread adoption. The performance gains were too small and too situational. The fabrication process was too time-consuming. The learning curve was too steep. Most pilots would not be able to master the technique in a reasonable time frame, but the engineers acknowledged that in specific circumstances, against specific opponents, the tactic could provide a tactical advantage. They recommended that individual pilots be allowed to experiment with asymmetric gun configurations if they desired, but it should not become standard doctrine. Caldwell received the report in early August. He was not surprised by the conclusion. The military did not adopt tactics based on individual ingenuity. They adopted tactics that could be taught to thousands of pilots and applied consistently across all theaters of operation. Caldwell's wing gun was a one-off solution to a specific problem in a specific theater. It worked in the Aleutians because the weather was unpredictable and the combat engagements were short and chaotic. It might not work in the South Pacific or over Europe, where the combat dynamics were different. But for Caldwell, the wing gun had done its job. It had kept him alive through 16 combat engagements with Japanese fighters, 0 losses, 0 hits. That was all that mattered. Now, if you are thinking that this kind of outside-the-box engineering is exactly the kind of story that needs to be remembered, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. We are digging through archives and maintenance logs to find the stories that never made it into the history books. The mechanics who fabricated battlefield solutions from scrap metal, the pilots who took risks on unproven tactics, the men who survived because they refused to do things the way everyone else did them. Subscribe and make sure you do not miss the next one. The Aleutian campaign officially ended in August of 1943. American forces launched an invasion of Kiska Island on August 15th. They found the island abandoned. The Japanese had evacuated the entire garrison under cover of fog 2 weeks earlier. The Americans had been bombing and shelling an empty island for 14 days. The war in the Aleutians was over. Caldwell flew his last combat mission on August 10th, a routine patrol over the Bering Sea. No contact with enemy aircraft. He returned to base, landed, and received orders to return to the continental United States. The squadron was being rotated stateside for rest and refit. Caldwell packed his gear and prepared to leave. Sergeant Briggs asked what he wanted to do with the wing-mounted Harney and Giles gun. Caldwell told Briggs to remove it and store it with the rest of the spare parts. Somebody else might find a use for it. Briggs removed the gun and the custom ammunition box. He stored them in a maintenance shed along with other salvaged equipment: propellers, engine parts, gun mounts, radios. The detritus of a campaign that most Americans would forget as soon as it ended. Caldwell left Amchitka on August 18th aboard a C-47 transport. He flew to Anchorage, then to Seattle, then to Nebraska. He was home by August 25th, 30 days of leave before reassignment. Caldwell spent the first week at his family's farm outside Omaha. He did not talk about the Aleutians. He did not talk about the Zeros or the wing gun or the engagements over the Bering Sea. His father asked if he had shot down any Japanese planes. Caldwell said he had shot down one Zero and damaged several bombers. His father wanted details. Caldwell said it was not worth talking about. The old man did not understand. For Caldwell, the war had not been about kills or glory. It had been about survival, about figuring out how to stay alive when the enemy had better aircraft and better training. The wing gun had been part of that. A tool, nothing more. In September, Caldwell received orders to report to Eglin Field in Florida. He would be joining a test squadron evaluating new fighter tactics for the P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47 was replacing the P-40 in most theaters: bigger, faster, heavier, better climb rate, better firepower, better survivability, but also less maneuverable. The P-47 could not turn with a Zero any better than the P-40 could. Caldwell spent 6 months at Eglin Field testing defensive tactics for the P-47. He tried to replicate the wing gun concept using the P-47's 850 caliber Brownings, but the gun layout did not allow for asymmetric configurations. All 8 guns were mounted in the wings, 4 per side. You could not fire one side independently to create asymmetric drag. The flight control systems did not support it. Caldwell suggested mounting an additional lightweight gun under one wing, the same way he had done with the P-40. The test squadron commander rejected the idea. Adding drag to a P-47 would negate its primary advantage, which was speed and energy retention. The P-47 was not meant to turn with enemy fighters. It was meant to dive, attack, and climb back to altitude before the enemy could react. Adding drag would slow it down and make it vulnerable. Caldwell did not argue. He understood the logic. The P-47 required different tactics. The wing gun concept was specific to the P-40 and specific to the tactical environment in the Aleutians. It would not work everywhere. By early 1944, Caldwell was reassigned to the European theater. He joined the 357th Fighter Group flying P-51 Mustangs out of England. The P-51 was the best American fighter of the war. Fast, maneuverable, long-range. It could escort bombers deep into Germany and engage German fighters on equal terms. Caldwell flew his first mission over Europe on March 6, 1944, a bomber escort mission to Frankfurt. The mission lasted 4 hours and 30 minutes. No contact with enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe was conserving its forces, avoiding engagement unless the odds were in their favor. Caldwell flew 23 more missions over Europe between March and June of 1944. He engaged German fighters on 4 of those missions: Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s. He shot down 2 FW-190s and damaged 1 Me-109, standard boom and zoom tactics, high-speed diving attacks followed by climbs back to altitude. No tight turns, no asymmetric drag tricks. The P-51 did not need them. It was fast enough and maneuverable enough to fight German fighters on its own terms. Caldwell's war ended on June 18, 1944. He was leading a 4-ship flight escorting B-17 bombers to a target near Munich. German fighters intercepted the formation at 26,000 feet, a mixed group of FW-190s and Me-109s. Caldwell engaged an FW-190 that was diving on the bombers. He fired a long burst from his .650 caliber Brownings. The FW-190's engine exploded. The German fighter rolled inverted and fell. Caldwell pulled up and scanned for more threats. Another FW-190 was diving toward him from 4 o'clock high. Caldwell broke right and dove. The FW-190 followed. Caldwell pushed the throttle to full power and dove at maximum speed. The P-51's airspeed climbed past 450 miles per hour. The FW-190 could not keep up. It broke off the attack and climbed back to altitude. But Caldwell's dive had taken him below the bomber formation. He was alone at 18,000 feet with German fighters above him. He began climbing back to rejoin the formation. An Me-109 dove on him from 7 o'clock high. Caldwell saw the 109 late. Too late. The German pilot fired a 2-second burst from his 20mm cannon. One round hit Caldwell's P-51 in the left wing. The wing exploded. The P-51 rolled violently to the left and entered an uncontrolled spin. Caldwell fought the controls. The stick was sluggish. The rudder was not responding. The P-51 was coming apart. He reached for the canopy release and bailed out at 15,000 feet. His parachute opened at 12,000 feet. He floated down through scattered clouds and landed in a forest 20 miles south of Munich. German troops captured him 3 hours later. Caldwell spent the rest of the war in a POW camp near Nuremberg. He was liberated by American forces in April of 1945. He returned to the United States in May. The Army Air Forces offered him a regular commission after the war. He declined. He had flown enough. He had survived 2 theaters of war and 47 combat missions. That was enough for one lifetime. Caldwell returned to Nebraska and bought a small airfield outside Omaha. He started a crop dusting business using surplus Stearman biplanes. He flew crop dusting runs for local farms through the 1950s and 1960s. He never talked about the war. He never attended squadron reunions. He never joined veterans organizations. In 1968, a historian researching the Aleutian campaign contacted Caldwell. The historian had found references to a P-40 pilot who had used an unconventional wing-mounted gun to evade Japanese Zeros. The historian wanted to know if Caldwell could provide details. Caldwell agreed to an interview. He described the Harney and Giles gun, the custom mount, the asymmetric drag tactic. He explained how the gun had worked and why it had been effective against Zeros. The historian asked if Caldwell still had the gun. Caldwell said he did not. He had left it in the Aleutians when he rotated stateside. The historian asked if Caldwell knew what happened to the gun after the war. Caldwell said he had no idea, probably scrapped along with all the other surplus equipment. The historian published a book about the Aleutian campaign in 1971. The book included a 2-page section about Caldwell's wing gun. The section was titled Improvised Solutions, the Mail Order Gun. The book sold modestly. Most readers focused on the larger battles at Attu and Kiska. The wing gun was a footnote. An interesting anecdote, but not significant in the broader context of the campaign. Caldwell read the book when it came out. He thought the historian had done a good job with the facts. But the historian had missed the point. The wing gun had not been about innovation or engineering brilliance. It had been about desperation, about a pilot trying to survive against an enemy that had better aircraft and better tactics. The gun had worked because Caldwell had been willing to try something that everyone else thought was crazy. That was the real lesson. Not the aerodynamics, not the fabrication techniques. The willingness to ignore the experts and try something different. Caldwell died on November 14, 1998. He was 79 years old. He left behind a wife, 3 children, and a small airfield that his son still operates today. The obituary in the Omaha newspaper mentioned that Caldwell had served in World War II as a fighter pilot. It did not mention the Aleutians. It did not mention the wing gun. It did not mention the Zeros. Most people who attended Caldwell's funeral did not know he had flown combat missions. They knew him as a crop duster, a quiet man who flew old biplanes and kept to himself. That was how Caldwell wanted it. The wing-mounted Harney and Giles gun that Caldwell left behind on Amchitka Island in August of 1943 was rediscovered in 1987 by a salvage team cleaning out old military equipment from abandoned Aleutian bases. The gun was found in a maintenance shed along with other forgotten parts. Rusty, corroded, but still identifiable. The salvage team did not know what it was or why it had been mounted under a fighter's wing. They cataloged it as miscellaneous ordnance and shipped it to a military surplus yard in California. In 1991, a firearms collector bought the gun at a surplus auction for $45. He recognized it as a Harney and Giles 30 caliber, a rare training gun from the early 1940s. But he did not know about its history. He cleaned it, oiled it, and displayed it in his collection along with other World War II small arms. In 2003, the collector attended a gun show in Reno, Nevada. He brought the Harney and Giles to display. A veteran visiting the show stopped at the collector's table and stared at the gun. The veteran asked where the collector had found it. The collector explained he had bought it at a surplus auction in California. The gun had come from the Aleutian Islands. The veteran asked if the gun had ever been mounted on an aircraft. The collector did not know. The veteran examined the gun mount. He pointed out the custom fabrication, the bolt holes that matched the spacing for a P-40 wing hardpoint. He said this gun had been mounted under a fighter's wing. The collector asked how the veteran knew that. The veteran said he had been an aircraft mechanic in the Aleutians during World War II. He had seen a P-40 with a wing-mounted gun just like this one. He remembered the pilot who flew that P-40, a lieutenant from Nebraska. Quiet guy, smart. The other pilots had mocked his mail-order gun until it saved his life against a Zero. The collector asked if the veteran remembered the pilot's name. The veteran said he did not. Too many years, too many faces, but he remembered the gun, and he remembered the story. If you have made it this far, you understand why these stories matter. These were not the big battles. These were not the famous aces with 20 kills. These were the individual solutions, the forgotten innovations, the men who survived because they were willing to look at a problem differently. If that resonates with you, hit that like button one more time. And if you have not subscribed, what are you waiting for? We are telling the stories that your history teacher never mentioned. The mechanics, the fabricators, the pilots who took risks on ideas that should not have worked but did. Subscribe and help us keep these memories alive. The Harney and Giles gun is now on display at the Museum of the Aleutians in Dutch Harbor, Alaska. The museum acquired it in 2007 after the collector donated it. The gun sits in a glass case alongside other artifacts from the Aleutian campaign, rusty and worn, but intact. The placard next to the gun reads, Harney and Giles 30 caliber machine gun, circa 1942, believed to have been mounted on a P-40 Warhawk fighter during the Aleutian campaign. Custom fabrication suggests unconventional tactical application. Pilot unknown. Pilot unknown. That part is not entirely accurate anymore. Historians have since identified Caldwell as the pilot who flew the modified P-40. His name appears in squadron records and after-action reports from the 343rd Fighter Group. The records confirm that Caldwell flew 16 combat missions with a wing-mounted gun configuration between June and August of 1943. The records also confirm that Caldwell survived all 16 missions with 0 aircraft losses and 0 combat damage from enemy fighters. The 0 that shot a hole in his wing during the first engagement was the only time a Japanese fighter ever landed a hit on Caldwell's P-40. After that, nothing. No hits, no damage, no close calls. The wing gun had worked exactly as Caldwell intended. It had created enough unpredictability to keep him alive. That was the entire point. Not to shoot down more enemies, not to win dogfights, just to survive. The Japanese Zero was a superior fighter in almost every measurable category. Speed, climb rate, turn rate, range. The P-40 could not match it. But the P-40 had one advantage that no specification sheet could quantify. It had pilots who were willing to try unconventional solutions. Caldwell was one of those pilots. He saw a problem, the Zero's superior maneuverability, and he engineered a solution, asymmetric drag, to tighten turn radius. He tested the solution, refined it, and proved it worked. Then he moved on. No fanfare, no publicity, no medal ceremonies. Just another day in the Aleutians. The story of Caldwell's wing gun is not a story about technology. It is a story about mindset, about refusing to accept limitations, about looking at a problem from a different angle and asking, what if? What if adding drag could improve performance in specific circumstances? What if a lightweight mail-order gun could create tactical advantages that a standard gun layout could not? What if the experts were wrong? Caldwell asked those questions. He tested the answers, and he survived because of it. That mindset defined a generation. The men who fought World War II did not have time to wait for perfect solutions. They had to improvise, adapt, and solve problems with whatever materials and knowledge they had available. They fabricated gun mounts from scrap metal. They modified engines to run on lower-grade fuel. They rewired radios to extend their range. They did not wait for headquarters to approve their ideas. They built the solutions, tested them, and used them. If the solutions worked, they kept using them. If they did not work, they tried something else. Caldwell's wing gun worked. It worked because Caldwell understood the principles of aerodynamics well enough to predict how asymmetric drag would affect turn performance. It worked because Sergeant Briggs was skilled enough to fabricate a reliable gun mount and ammunition feed system. It worked because the Japanese Zero pilots did not anticipate that an American P-40 would execute flight maneuvers that should have been impossible for that airframe. 3 factors: knowledge, skill, and unpredictability. Remove any one of those factors and the wing gun would have failed. Caldwell would have been shot down on June 12, 1943, and nobody would have ever heard about the mail-order gun. But all three factors were present. The wing gun succeeded. Caldwell survived. And the story became a footnote in the history of the Aleutian campaign. A footnote that almost nobody remembers. That is why we are telling this story, because footnotes matter, because the forgotten innovations and improvised solutions are just as important as the famous battles and celebrated heroes. Because the men who fabricated battlefield fixes from mail-order parts deserve to be remembered alongside the men who led armies and commanded fleets. If you believe that, if you believe these stories need to be told, then subscribe. Make sure you are here for the next one. We have more stories like this. Stories about the mechanics who kept aircraft flying with parts that should not have worked. Stories about the engineers who designed weapons in the field because the factory-built versions were inadequate. Stories about the pilots who survived because they refused to follow standard doctrine. These stories are disappearing. The men who lived them are gone. The equipment they built has been scrapped. The bases they operated from have been abandoned. But the stories remain. In squadron records, in maintenance logs, in after-action reports, buried in archives, waiting to be found. We are finding them, we are telling them, and we need you to help us share them. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, share this video, tell your friends. These stories belong to all of us. They are part of our history, part of our heritage. They remind us that ordinary people can solve extraordinary problems when they are willing to think differently. Frank Caldwell was an ordinary pilot. He was not an ace. He did not command squadrons or lead major operations. He flew crop dusters before the war and crop dusters after the war. But for 16 missions over the Aleutian Islands in the summer of 1943, he flew a P-40 Warhawk with a mail-order machine gun bolted under the wing. And that gun, that ridiculous jury-rigged contraption that everyone mocked, gave him just enough of an edge to survive encounters with the best fighter pilots Japan had to offer. That is not a footnote. That is a lesson about ingenuity, persistence, and the willingness to ignore the people who say something cannot be done. Frank Caldwell ignored those people. He built his solution, he tested it, he proved it worked, and then he went home and never talked about it again. But we are talking about it now. We are making sure his story does not disappear. We are making sure that the mail-order gun and the crop duster from Nebraska and the 16 missions over the Bering Sea are remembered, because if we do not remember them, nobody will. And that would be a damn shame. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for helping us keep these stories alive. Hit that like button one last time. Subscribe if you have not already. And we will see you in the next one.